Welcome back. So this week we're going to cover a bunch of slides about some positive news for uranium investors and uranium in general. And if you want to extend that to environmental and even ESG, if that's your forte, then stay tuned and a bunch of things to cover. But first, weekly portfolio performance. I only added one thing, and that was a share of URNM, Uranium Miner ETF. Bought the dip this morning, but there's been a lot of dips throughout the week to be buying. So I believe URNJ, the junior uranium mining ETF that Sprout released, since inception, I believe it's down approximately 10%. And since that same time, URNM's down, I believe, 6.5%. So the reason I'm mentioning this is that when things turn around, whenever that may be, you should see a similar outperformance, one would think, to the upside as it's had to the downside. So if you're willing to take that risk, then that could be quite rewarding. BTU Peabody had earnings on Tuesday, and it's given back over half the gains that it made since then. It about went up 10-11%, and it's given back about 6%. And Lou, interestingly enough, Centrus Energy, it had really an amazing week, and then today it just got slammed. It's down like 10%. Rig, as you can see, I'm up 40% on my position, but that was upwards of 52%. So that's down. It's just been a down week, which is interesting with these higher volatility portfolios like this, because I believe the SPY S&P is down, I don't know, 40 basis points, 0.4% on the week. So that's always worth keeping in mind. But let's get into it. Some of these I'm going to read, some of these I'll let you read on your own, because I understand that there's people watching and there's people just listening. So with that, I also might just select portions of this. By the way, I have a very disorganized, it's not titled nicely or anything like that, but I've placed a lot of links in the description box to these articles. Some of them are behind a paywall, like the Bloomberg articles, unless they're still allowing 4 free reads a month or something like that. So keep that in mind. But there'll be a lot of extensions in the description if you want to read further into these things. So on this one, what it's summing up is that a different challenge is occurring, and that's eliminating the dependence on Russian uranium. In 2021, U.S. uranium mines produced 21,000 pounds of uranium concentrate, an 88% decrease from 2019 production levels, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, EIA. That year, Russia supplied roughly 1/7 of all uranium purchased by U.S. producers. Last Congress, Barroso introduced bills to ban Russian uranium imports and to create a U.S. uranium reserve. Now, even if we don't ban, now I'm not reading from this, but even if we don't ban Russian uranium imports, it shouldn't be too far-fetched to think that we might try to find other places to find uranium the best that we can. And those things are being done. So keep that in mind. We support both taking care of our existing reactors, and we support a very robust, aggressive uranium strategy for low-enrichment uranium and HALEU, Turk said at the hearing, referring to the high-assay, low-enriched uranium used in more advanced reactors. If you hear much about the SMRs, small modular reactors, a lot of that is intermingled with the idea of HALEU, the high-assay, low-enriched uranium. It's not clear that whether the DOE has the authority to repurpose funds from the Civil Nuclear Credit Program. Matt Crozat, the executive director of policy developed at the Nuclear Energy Institute, said the option was worth looking into. Okay, now the whole point of all of this is simply to say that the government's talking about these things. That's good. You want it to be disseminated throughout the populace and the governing bodies, because people start talking about it and then they become accustomed to the idea. You actually see this with the central bank digital currency idea. That idea has been in the making. It's desensitizing people. It's having people have discussions, and slowly the adoption, not the Gartner hype cycle, but the innovation adoption curve develops and plays out. So that's fine. Information's being dispersed throughout. That's a positive. Korea pivots to nuclear at the expense of renewables. This is going to be a theme in this, is how people are getting sick and tired with this placeholder category known as renewables. And then the bastardization of it, as well as the intermingling of ESG, and then how ESG is correlated. But there's this tangential association. So then ESG is associated with Democrats, and well, half the voting population in the United States don't like Democrats, so it's probably best to not eliminate half your market to something from the get-go, and that's just because of fallacy and cope and bias and so on and so forth, but that's beside the point. Okay, so a very large theme of this is how nuclear can capture some of their energy producing share from renewables, and how the spin will get put on it, and the fact of the matter that it's carbon neutral. So you can have your renewables and not pollute too, but renewable will be nuclear. Anyway, Korea pivots to nuclear at the expense of renewables. You see the 2030 projections and how nuclear is going to grow and how other things are going to shrink. South Korea president has scrapped the predecessor's nuclear phase-out policy. Another theme in this piece. Nuclear has become the centerpiece of the country's decarbonization strategy, while renewables saw a lowering of its midterm deployment target. South Korea's 10th Basic Plan for Electricity Supply and Demand raised the country's 2030 target for nuclear generation to 32.4%, while lowering that for renewables to 21.6%. Which is to say that it's dropping from 30% to 21.6%. And as I just said a moment ago, the reason this matters is because nuclear will be picking up what renewables drops off. Are people catching on to the ESG and greenwashing? If so, might that be a positive for nuclear? As we've discussed, the answer is could be. This is a chart of annual sustainable debt issuance, green bonds, sustainably linked loans, sustainability bonds, social bonds, green bonds, blah, blah, blah. And how it's grown, and then 21 occurred, and then from 21 to 22, it dropped because, well, the general idea out on the street is that with the Russian invasion, it really made people think twice about actually having sustainable energy for their country. Like a person might think would be a good idea, but most people need catastrophe and bad happenstance to occur before they're willing to do intelligent things. In part because they get complacent, but in part because that's how human functions, and that's the human reaction function. Bloomberg. Texas' biggest pension fund has divested its direct ownership stakes in BlackRock Incorporated and several other financial firms to comply with a state law prohibiting investing in companies deemed to be discriminatory against the oil and gas industry. That's the funny thing about DIE, diversity, inclusion, and equity, is it's anything but. The teacher retirement system of Texas sold shares in BlackRock, Credit Suisse Group, and several other firms and funds to remain in compliance with the law, according to a letter to Texas officials dated December 31st and obtained by Bloomberg on Monday. The letter from Executive Director didn't cite the value of the divestitures. The pension has about $173 billion in assets under management. Texas is one of a growing number of states, which, by the way, Texas is one of the largest growing states. You shouldn't just think of it as rednecks of the South, but actually a bustling economy which is growing, known as the Sun Belt. Texas is one of a growing number of states cracking down on Wall Street for pursuing investment strategies that considers a company's environmental, social, and governance record. BlackRock, an outspoken advocate for ESG, has borne the brunt of the criticism. 6 states have said that they plan to pull more than $3 billion from BlackRock, while House Republicans are pushing back on Biden administration's efforts to bolster ESG investing. This is a common theme, both because they're losing money, as we're going to get into, but also because people really don't like the the rhetorical smokescreen, which is much of ESG due to its bastardized nature and co-opting by pathological people to promote other agendas and tell people how to live their lives. So, on to the losing money aspect. Siemens Gamesa, the second largest manufacturer of wind turbines in the world, I believe, its order book fell 46%, while the prices of it went up 32%. Now, you could say that prices going up helps compensate buying going down, and fair enough, but what this shows, or can say, this is reading into it, because I haven't read into it, is that people aren't buying as much, as well as prices are going up, which, well, makes it more prohibitive for people to buy, especially when you look at it on a return on a investment in energy. They made $10.5 billion in revenue, but their cost of revenue, cost of goods sold, were $11.2 billion. They ended up losing $1.5 billion by the time they got to the net income, part of the income statement. 0 orders in their last quarter. Now, I will say that some of their money, because they, I don't know, built some faulty parts and had to do a lot more maintenance and replacement than normal, so that cut into their profits. But it's generally, if you look back, a pretty profitless company. Probably should go into the growth stock category. At least investing in them, maybe you're decarbonizing the world as opposed to pumping and dumping some shitco and fraud. But what do I know? And the stock price reacted accordingly by dropping a easy 25% in a few days. Coming to a campus near you, nuclear microreactors. Remember, university is the epicenter of wokeness. Just as they have been the breeding ground for much of the pathology in the country, they equally can be a catalyst for change in regards to good things. And I'm going to use good things synonymously with nuclear. Penn State, University of Illinois, Purdue University are all mentioned in this article. It's also worth noting that the mainstream media is now discussing the nuclear agenda. This isn't a Nuclear Energy Institute, World Nuclear Association, or government organization. No, it's NBC. You have to remember that much of being carbon zero is about exporting carbon emissions and then doing mental gymnastics and mental accounting to justify it all. It's really more, as I've mentioned before a few videos ago, it's a not in my backyard phenomenon. And a multi-hundred acre nuclear complex isn't that palatable to most people and isn't something that most people want in their backyard. As noted in the article from the last slide, the urgency of the climate crisis means zero carbon nuclear energy must be scaled up soon. It has to be a small manufactured product as opposed to a large bespoke construction project. And I think there's a lot of validity to that statement. Small modular reactors have a low footprint and are less of an eyesore, and that's important for the psychological satisfaction that's necessary to implement the installment of those nuclear reactors. And terms like microreactor, as they're using, I kind of found entertaining because it sounds pleasant. Because normally when you're talking about something that people don't like, the first thing you do is you change the name of it. You give it a different title. I believe, shooting from the hip here, but global warming became, climate change or something like that, because global warming was getting a lot of backlash. So you just change the title of it. And then people are quite simply, honestly, that easy to fool, and then they start being more accepting of it. So I like that, a micro-reactor. It's kind of like a microbrewery. And a lot of the people against nuclear are more of the hippie-esque type people who like to drink microbrewery craft beers. So we can call it craft nuclear. I like that. That sounds good. Craft nuclear. Net zero doesn't refer to their carbon emissions, but their bottom line. Yet again, why does this matter for nuclear? How is this bullish for nuclear? Well, once bitten, twice shy. as people lose money on it, at first it was all the cool kids were doing it, so why not? They were pressured into doing it, and peer pressure is a strong influence. But once you start losing money on it, and then that starts hitting your compensation package as a CEO or C-suite or board of directors or whatever it may be, or your performance bonus as a smaller operator, middle management, you really start caring about these things. So, in recent times, Duke has taken a $1.3 billion charge to renewables. Dominion Energy has taken a non-cash impairment charge of $1.5 billion. Europe's oil giants, BP, slows green goals and acts more like Exxon, which is really to say, because Exxon is such a disparaging word, what they're really saying is they're actually doing their job again. That's what they're really saying. Yet again, all of this is positive because the energy production isn't just going to stop, it has to go somewhere, so who's going to pick up the slack? Well, it's not going to be coal. Everybody's hating on oil. The whole nat gas Russian thing kind of put a bad taste in people's mouth. Like we're running out of options. And a lot of this is actually, so that's solar, that's wind, and then that's nuclear. And then you just read the playing field, look at the chessboard, and you see a lot of people are taking massive impairments on solar and wind, and then nuclear is getting more and more lovely news headlines. So, I don't know. Seems positive in nuclear. At the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference that happened here recently, there was a lot of positive news and energy and thoughts about uranium. Amid the energy crisis accelerated by the Russian-Ukraine war, countries like Japan, France, South Korea, which we've covered, India, the UK, the US, and Germany recently announced new constructions and additional incentives and funding for nuclear power. Not only are they doing restarts, but they're extending the life of them, and they're also doing new builds. That's all positive. Incremental, slow change. That's how I like narratives to develop. I don't like volatile portfolio performance. I mean, it'd be nice, slow and steady, but that's not how you normally get it. But in the news cycle, it's coming about more and more so. Rick Rule said, I think the principal factor is, and if you don't know who Rick Rule is, look him up. Smart guy. Been in the industry for a long time. Not just uranium, but mining and resources in general. He said, I think the principal factor is the change of public's opinion in Japan with regards to the pace of Japanese restarts. The biggest source of new demand that you could have on the planet is from their 40 existing reactors. They don't have to be built. They just have to be restarted. That would raise the structural demand for uranium by 10 to 12 million pounds a year. And just as Japan led us on the way down, it should be of no wonder or surprise that they would also lead us on the way back up. It's come full circle. They helped in the dump, and now they're going to help in the pump. The Japanese cabinet approves change in their nuclear policy. Under the new policy, which describes nuclear power as a power source that contributes to energy security and has high decarbonization effects, Japan will maximize the use of existing reactors by restarting as many of them as possible and prolonging the operating life of aging ones beyond the current 60-year limit. The government also said the country will develop advanced reactors to replace those that are decommissioned. That is absolutely wonderful news. And back to uranium prices and uranium stocks. The thing is with this, with us being at a primary production deficit to demand, even though they're secondary supply, the thing is there'll be those who won't sell expecting higher prices. Then there'll be those who are positioned offsides, which will panic. That'll be the fuel buyers. Offsides, which will panic buy with price agnostic fever. Now, of course, some people are a very OPEC contract market, so it'll be hard to know what's going on exactly, and you can do the math and see how many pounds of producer produces, and then see how much money they made, and then you can kind of think as more and more contract markets get developed, what will happen is the spot price, which everybody pays attention to because so many people have been buying on the spot price because it's cheaper to buy on the spot price and fulfill your takeoff orders and obligations and contracts than it is to actually produce the stuff. So spot price has come to matter a lot in the past years. But what's going to happen is that spot price is going to matter less and contract price is going to matter more. But the problem with that is that the contract orders are more opaque. So you'll have to put in the work to figure out what they're fetching. Then, I'd like to note, the speculators will come in buying the most worthless and overvalued companies. But that won't matter how worthless they are. If you look back to the GME pump, it was worth, the market cap was a little over $1 billion. Right now, Energy Fuels and Denison are sitting around that $1 billion range. Cameco is sitting at $12 billion. GME squeezed close to $22 billion. So just to put in perspective, the degree and magnitude of moves that can happen in markets. So GME's market cap 22x'd. Now, it was very short-lived and intraday high and so on and so forth, but it just is to only emphasize and help put in perspective the kinds of things that can come about in markets. Because most people really don't think much about right tail risk, which is why a 1% short position can become a fifth of your book really quick when something 20x's. You have to remember that mining is the OG degenerate gambler parlor. The tech growth stocks and the SaaS bros simply found a new medium to play an old game. And here's point in case, this little screenshot I took. Just because it's a decade-long bull thesis, it will not stop the weekly call option bros and gamblers from absolutely speculating. And by the way, ultimately just erasing much of the potential gain if they would just have some common sense, buy a position, and just sit on the damn thing and ride it out. Here, weekly call options on their uranium play. I don't know what they're thinking. You know, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you about that. I mean, you're destined to lose money is really all I have to say to that. Here's some more headlines. France considers tapping savers for nuclear reactor funding. And then, now juxtapose that with their promise of energy security via wind and solar. France could close up to 17 nuclear reactors by 2025. Germany, nuclear power plants to be closed by 2022. ... Germany extends lifetime of remaining nuclear plants. And it's kind of interesting because they said back after the Fukushima, which is why you can't take people's further word because they're subjective emotionalists and irrational and do whatever the moment says, and they project the future based upon what's happened in the most recent path, which is, you know, not good. But this came out in 2011, this little article piece. Mr. Rotkin said, it's definite. The latest in for the last 3 nuclear power plants is 2022. There will be no clause for revision. Now remember this, when governments say things, they don't actually mean it. Mr. Rotkin said a tax on spent fuel rods expected to raise 2.3 billion euros a year from this year would remain despite the shutdown. Ms. Merkel's center-right Christian Democrats met their junior partners on Sunday after the ethics panel had delivered its conclusion. Before the meeting, she said, I think we're on a good path, but very, very many questions have to be considered. If you want to exit something, right, isn't this amazing? She said this a decade ago. If you want to exit something, you have to prove how the change will work and how we can enter into a durable and sustainable energy provision. The previous German government, a coalition of the center-left Social Democrats and the Greens, decided to shut down Germany's nuclear power stations by 2021. However, last September, Chancellor Merkel's coalition scrapped those plans, announcing it would extend the life of the country's nuclear reactors by an average of 12 years. Ministers said they needed to keep nuclear energy as a bridging technology to a greener future. Wow, what a thought. Like, maybe actually have baseload power before you cut out the baseload power you currently have. The decision to extend was unpopular in Germany, even though it's radioactive leaks at the Fukushima plant. But following Fukushima, Miss Merkel's promptly scrapped her extension plans and announced a review. Now, isn't that funny? So what that is to say is we actually don't need a bridging technology, and we really don't need to answer all those questions, and we really don't need to actually prove how the change will work. It's quite interesting at all. But this is how people think. You can shit on a government official, but this is how average people think. This is how they act. They're reactionary, not proactive. In a recent publication on Sprouts Insights, which I would recommend anybody participating in the uranium trade to read upon, they said that the price for uranium conversion and enrichment services more than doubled in 2022, a significant outperformance relative to the U308 uranium spot price. We believe this upward price pressure will support the uranium spot price. While Russia accounts for a small portion of U308 production at 6% of the global total, it controls about 27% of the global uranium conversion capacity and 34% of fuel enrichment. Although there have yet to be sanctions on either Russian uranium or conversion enrichment services, and legacy contracts are being honored, utilities are not signing any new contracts with Russian entities. In response, Western countries are investing in and supporting the expansion of local conversion and enrichment capacity, which is a very true statement. Convern Dine is coming online, allegedly, this year, and then Westinghouse is doing its thing, and then I can't remember, the French company is working on its conversion, and so that is a true statement. There has been an unprecedented number of announcements for nuclear power plant restarts, life extensions, and new builds that are likely to create incremental demand for uranium. So everything we've been talking about. However, the current uranium price still remains below incentive levels to restart Tier 2 production, let alone greenfield development. Now, in all reality, the Tier 2 production and just even Tier 1 production, if it all came online full force, whether it's, I'm forgetting, Paladin's operation that's restarting, and then you have MacArthur, and then, well, Kazatomprom is missing, but in all honesty, you don't need greenfield development per se to supply, at least in the short couple of years future. You just need the big dogs to come online and for things not to go wrong, and then the Tier 2 will fill in, but that doesn't mean they won't do well or outperform Tier 1 producers, because, well, in the bull market, shittier companies do better than good companies because they have more leverage and more risk, and that's how people gamble. Here's a chart they provided, questioning as to whether we're in bull market 3. You have the 70s bull market, and then you had the early 2000s bull market, and then the question is, where are we at in regards to things, and only time will tell. EU Commission scratches Russian nuclear sanction plans. See, the fact of the matter is that people virtue signal only to the extent of self-interest. And we've talked about this before earlier in this video, as well as other videos, that the virtue signaling mechanism is one to say that we are so wealthy that we can do stupid things and other people can pay the negative externalities of those stupid things. That's in part. I mean, we're not going to get into a whole conversation about it. But at the end of the day, you want to keep the lights on, and you also want to stay in power, so you better be able to keep the lights on. Which means if we're not able to, we'll just keep buying Russian nuclear sanctions, or we'll keep buying Russian nuclear, and we'll continue to talk about Putin bad, but we'll more than happily fund his war against Ukraine in doing so, because, well, people often conflate morality with cowardice, and they like to virtue signal until you hold their feet to the fire, let's say. Russia's grip on nuclear power trade is only getting stronger. Russian nuclear exports are booming. Revenue rose to a 4-year high, bolstered by fuel sales to China. Now you can say, why is this good? And it's good because more people, Eastern Europe, China, India, more places are buying more nuclear reactors and fuel, which places more demand on the producers and more demand on a market that's in a supply deficit. Well, primary production supply deficit. And the adoption of nuclear brings awareness, and more countries adopt nuclear. And then what happens is that herding and groupthink begins. Why do they have nuclear and we don't have nuclear? I heard they have cheaper energy prices because they have nuclear. Why don't we have nuclear? They don't have to worry about exogenous political events affecting their energy because they have stockpiles for years to come, which, by the way, is also going to put pressure on the market because anybody with any sense whatsoever, I believe France historically has kept, like 7 to 9 years worth of uranium on hand to supply the reactors because, energy security kind of matters, especially when you rely heavily on a single source. So over time, group thinks and herding begins, and then people do what other people do because that's what people do. So that's actually good news. And there's probably going to be some supply constraints and logistical concerns that could put short-term pressure on things, but I really don't care about things like that when it comes to a more macro, larger thesis. The GOAT himself, greatest of all time, Stan Druckenmiller, in his family office, has bought Cameco. Now, this man is renowned for, he said it himself that, he might be thumping the tables really hard. He's one of these strong opinions held weekly type. And he could be in a trade today and out tomorrow if something changes. Because he's a very astute investor, and anybody who's not familiar with him should get familiar with him if they want to be a wise, intelligent person and have a role model to look up to and think about things. Germany, which has been one of the stalwarts of being anti-nuclear in Europe, has seen tidal shifts in sentiment towards atomic energy, as they call it. And nuclear, 71% of Germans for nuclear power plants. Here we have Slovakia. They're finally getting their grid fired up, nuclear reacted, and their number 3 reactor has been brought online. And then I think by the time they get the 4th reactor up, they're going to get a very large percent, I believe, and they'll probably end up being a net exporter of energy to neighboring countries. So good for them. This is what can be done. This doesn't look too horrible and disgusting, does it? A lot of green forests. That looks nice. And that's the presentation. Like I said, I have a lot of the links just placed in the description box if you want to watch them. If y'all like this video, give it a thumbs up. Let me know. I have enough material. This has gone on long enough. I have enough material. I could do a second one of these. And either way, I probably will at some point. But if y'all really like it, I can do one sooner than later. I really don't want this to become a nuclear channel. But until offshore oil cuts me a break and I can buy at some lower prices, nuclear is kind of where I'm stuck at right now. And thank you for watching, and until next time, we'll talk. See ya.